Hi, I'm Chris from airwindows, and this plugin is fun. This is Point. I've had Point for a long time, and it's been a little bit of a well-kept secret weapon kind of thing. It's existed only as audio unit, so not everybody's heard of it until now. Point is a transient designer kind of thingy. It basically works on a really simple algorithm. It's one of those where what's inside it is not terribly complicated, and the adjusting that you do to it to get it to do strange things can be kind of fussy and fiddly. But here is a little bit of an example. We'll just throw on drums. Point with the transient being taken away almost completely and set to a certain setting. Now here's what you get when you turn that the other way. See, it's tracking the volume intensities on a sort of instant-by-instant basis, and then exaggerating or reducing them based on its own bizarre little algorithms. So what you got is... Ow. What you got is complete madness. I'm sorry about that. Let's start over. Or no, wait, let's not start over. Be careful, kids. When you have these little plugins, sometimes they can turn and bite you. And that was an alarming little moment. Why did it do that, I wonder? Can we make it do it again? See, it didn't want to start up in this condition. Mind you, it's perfectly happy to start up in this condition. Since Point is a transient agitator, if you started at sort of full crank, that might be an alarming time for you that you wouldn't necessarily want. In fact, I may have to go in and specially edit that just so that it doesn't hurt people in the YouTube video. The meters will reveal the true horror of the situation, and I will leave it so that you can see me react to it, because that's always fun, right? It's like a YouTube video of somebody tripping and falling on their face on a skateboard, which is also on a banana peel, down a set of cement staircases. Anyways, Point is an old, primitive, and obviously not completely tame transient designer. And you can make it reduce the amount of transient flare or exaggerate it. And we'll pat it right down, get it going. And I'll show you some of the range of behavior. Like the reaction speed of 0 is nothing's happening. But then as we get into this zone, this is something that you can use for a real gatey effect. Like this might work on a kick drum or something. Now bear in mind that as you change this, it redistributes where the energy of the transient is. This is capable of getting the front edge of the transient pretty good. But as we extend it outwards, we get a very different reaction. I've got clip only on the output of this, which is also free, mind you, so... Oh, and I'm going to have to shut that back off before turning it on again. So this can be used for a sort of gatey effect, or who knows what. As you keep slowing it down, you get a much more dispersed effect, whereas you speed it up, you're getting closer to the real onset transient. This could serve some uses, but I have always found that, and of course this is essentially your wet-dry control right here. If you're asking for a wet-dry, this is basically it, so use this. We can expand the peaks here, but in music mixing, so often we're not actually trying to exaggerate the peaks. Digital is capable of giving us peaks like this anyway. And what used to happen in analog recording was any number of things from mixing desks to analog tape soaked up these peaks, stepped on them, and stopped them from having these just massive front edges. So when we start using the negative effect and taking what's going on here, I'll leave it at this so you can listen to what it does. And dialing that back from the what came into the recorder down to cancellation, we start getting kind of a tapey, studio-y effect where it's stepping on the transients. Now, this particular setting of full minus point, it's exaggeratedly stepping on the transients to the point where they're just nuked and wiped out. But you don't have to get that extreme with it. One thing that's possible to do is to take the recording that you're working with and dial in only a certain amount of this. Say, for instance, that's a little bit too slow. That's a little bit too fast. So we're assuming that's where the transient is that we think our imitation tape ought to just soak up. What we do is we turn it down to 0 and then start exploring the range between this full cancellation, which sucks it out so hard that it doesn't even sound like a tape or anything anymore, and 0. And we'll listen to what we get. In fact, we can even bring it up to 0 dB here. Whenever I do that, what I'm doing is I'm typing in a number and then hitting tab, which switches away and locks in the number for me. Also bear in mind that all digital audio workstations are handling this part differently. I've run across somebody, probably a number of people, who are trying to use European Mac OSs in which they need to enter decimal points as a comma. Now that can be correct for European language localizations. Unfortunately, when you get rid of that, it's just going to put it back to the decimal point because Logic doesn't know from any of that stuff. It's using American number formats only. There's nothing much I can do about that because my plugin doesn't handle this part. I can type in 0,659 and say, whoop, this is Europe, so that is a decimal point. And then go, whoop, and it just ignores it. But if I do 0.659, it jumps to 66, but otherwise it's fine. So just heads up on that if you're in Europe and you use commas for decimal points. And at least one person has told me about this. I'm not in Europe, so I don't know. They could be making the whole thing up for all I know, but I somehow doubt it. You got to use the Americanization, unfortunately, to get something like Logic to work. I don't know about all plugins and things. But back to the point, if we want to get a sort of tapey effect, but we don't want the exaggerated effect, we start exploring in the middle here. Come on, snare. And again, this is too exaggerated, but that's not enough, so And in here, what we get is a way of handling the drum impacts using point that kind of feels a little bit like analog tapes or something, because it's scrunching the attack transient just a little bit, softening and rounding it out. Saturate it. Now you can work with this tone. And again, without point, it's recognizably still the same, but listen to what happens to the edges of the transients. This is something that you could do instead of going to fancy analog gear emulations. And as you can hear, it's honoring the tone of the recording pretty well. You don't always have to put a layer of sonic paint over everything. This is conditioning the tone of those drums in really a pretty useful way. But without it, you've got that kind of digital front edge. And then we take away the digital front edge. But of course we can go beyond that. What I started with was a rather special little reaction speed that I use specifically with just full cancellation. Take point, never mind that business about naturally dialing it back a little bit to make it feel more organic and like coming off of an analog tape without actually running a bunch of messy tape emulation stuff. This is full 80s nonsense in action. We'll start with reaction speed of 0, and we'll probably push the input trim up a little bit just for lulz. And point is at -1 and we'll stay there. Listen to what happens to this drum kit. Not quite that loud. Hear what's happening to this drums? And then it comes back. It's a very small window. And now it's acting weird because I went past that tiny window where the reaction speed was just locking down in the front edge only and hitting only the point on the front of the drum. I went right past it, so it started acting funny. Some of those things will work happier when you're just making stuff more clicky, like a bass drum or something like that. You might want to use that and have a certain amount of point boost. But for this crazy cancellation stuff, this is the sort of thing where some people would be making a dedicated plugin and being like, here is the preset for this. Just watch what it does. Starting to happen. And here we go. And then back out again. It's a very small window. So this gives us this freaky 80s sound. And the funny thing about it is it's not wildly different. Well, actually, it is wildly different. That's very wildly different. But some things about this are not crazily changed. The tonality of it is not crazily changed, but the character of it is just now from Mars. It's a big difference. And that's 177. And then if we start speeding it up a little bit, we can get a front edge onto that. And that's a whole other tone. Again, it's just this, then boom. There's a lot more definition on there because the whole thing is focusing in on an earlier front edge. And we'll bring that even a little bit farther. Now we have a hyper spotlight on the hi-hat. And that's one of the things that we're doing. So in this area, from around 138 to 145, we have this crazy hyped out hi-hat. And again, this doesn't have to be done an entire drum submix like this. You could throw this funny little plugin on individual elements. You could throw this on the hi-hat if you like what it's doing to that. We got the regular hat, and then listen to what happens to the hat as it goes into the we're starting to get a real spotlight in there. Out and then in. Yeah, there we go. Out. In. So if you needed that kind of definition on the front metallic edge of the hat, you might use something like that. Let me exaggerate it even farther, or we can dial it right back again. And soften things up a little bit more. Or a sort of swinging feel to it, like where rather than having the kind of hammering 80s quality, you slow it down even farther than that, and you get this sort of funny swinging feel to it because the range it's operating over has slowed down to the point where it's exaggerating other things. Slow it down this far, and we're starting to feel the kick drum hit because it's not able to react quite fast enough. So all it's doing is emphasizing the kick at that point. And in here we have this cancellation. We're just holding down the delay of the drums and exaggerating the front. And as we speed it up, first we're going to be zooming in on the attack of the kick, and then we start suppressing that and getting into that 80s zone like this. There's a kick with a certain amount of low frequency head to it. Certain amount of point, no pun intended. And then as we continue to speed it up, we're getting into a totally 80s zone where we pretty much just have the body of it exaggerated, and the front edge of that is cut entirely off. And remember, with all of this kind of stuff, we can always take it and use that point control, which is a kind of dry wet, and bring back in the rest of it. If this coloration is what we're looking for, but it's stomping on the actual transients too much, what we do is this. Because this is normal. This is exaggerated. So we just find a middle ground in there somewhere. And it has some of those qualities, but without being overly distracting. Hopefully you can get some use out of this. I mean, I'm only demonstrating it with drums. If I wanted to demonstrate it with something else, I could throw on, my usual silly music. And I say silly music, but I'm throwing it all up on a website, so the entire archive is going to be available. I'm tempted to let people use it for their, stuff, and patrons can ask me for high-resolution master copies of this stuff. We'll see. I'm working that stuff out. The thing about it is that if you're using something like full-on music, it has less drastic changes between transients and non-transients, so it's a little less easy to hear what it's doing. You got this, and then you got the smushy quality to it. Mind you, we're getting some of the effects, but just bear in mind that if you're doing that, what you're getting is the little micro transient changes between a bunch of stuff that's mixed together, so it's not on a large scale really being that transient at all. There's less to work with. It'll be a little less easy to hear what it's doing. However, we can always exaggerate it by increasing point. That works. So you're looking to exaggerate sort of the dynamic punch there. That's one possibility. Kind of like a expander, really. Or this may have its uses too. Anyways, I designed Point for things like drum tracks and stuff like that, or really just to see what it did, and discovered that this is what it did. So if you enjoy fooling around with transient designers and getting maybe sometimes outlandish results, sometimes terrifying results, be careful about things like that burst of loudness that almost clobbered me. Point is not a tame plugin. Point can do evil things to you, like 50 dB evil things if you start it on full crank. Kind of like this. Let us throw in purest gain again. Here's purest gain, 40 dB down. Beware the evilness of the point full boost. It's not necessarily a happy thing. It doesn't like going from 0 to full crank in one sample's time. That warning given, I hope you enjoy point and it doesn't hurt you too badly. And I hope it doesn't hurt your mixes too badly, but maybe that's just what you're looking for. Point is free, audio unit, Mac and PC VST. And it's free because I run a Patreon. And Patreon is a thing where if you were undertaking some kind of massive project like this one, like airwindows, where I've been working for 10 years developing hundreds of plugins, and I've decided that, I'm getting kind of old. One day I'm going to die, and when I do, what am I going to leave behind? Well, I've decided I'd like to watch. I'd like to see what I leave behind, so I'm going through this process of porting all of my plugins to free audio unit and Mac and PC VST, one by one. My hope is that people really appreciate and can use all of this stuff. And the Patreon is there because, well, maybe if I'm willing to give 100 or hundreds, not even 100, it's over 250, hundreds of plugins to producers and engineers and people who can use audio effects for free, knowing that it's harder and harder to make money doing this kind of thing. It's even harder and harder to make money making plugins, even if you try to sell them to everybody and claim that, they're the same thing as this hardware and you need that in order to sell 1 million records. Oh, nobody's going to sell 1 million records anymore. It's becoming about what you do for love and the sounds that you want to hear. I hope that other people can relate to the idea of a big project that is done for love of the craft and love of making funny little tools like this. And I hope people can get a lot of use out of this kind of thing. So I'm just going to keep on doing it. And, well, the link to my Patreon is in the video description, unless I screwed up somehow. I don't think so, though. I always remember that. Link to the Patreon is in my video description. If you're not kicking in already, please do. I think this is worth supporting. And I hope you like the scary transient designer Point and get some good use out of it. Thanks.